All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials World podcast. And you know what, Brian? Of course, we went about a week not recording because I was on vacation. But you know, when I was on vacation, coincidentally to the nation's capital, I decided to try a little bit of the amazing powders that they have over in the DC heartland. And you know what, Brian? It made my heart stop. Can you believe that?
You should be careful with that, with those powders.
Exactly. I was partying until my heart stopped. And you know what, Brian? I believe that's the
Until your
title of an
chest caved
album.
in, even.
Exactly, yes. My chest caved in until after my heart stopped. And I believe, Brian, both those things are titles of a band and an album that we both really like. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm aware of a band called Caven. I've heard them in passing a couple times in my life. Yeah.
I've heard of them too. So you know what? This week, Brian, I think we should review the album Until Your Heart Stops by Cave-In. Obviously a band that was very influential to last week's episode, A Day to Remember. I think we can both agree.
So I think they might be indirectly. I was thinking about that a lot this week.
I think so, definitely too. I think there is. I'm being a little shitty, but I do think there's some truth to that.
Yeah, no, I had the same thought, and it started out as like being kind of shitty, and the more I thought about it, I think a case could be made.
I think so too. So without further ado, let's get into our review. But before we get into our review this week, Brian, let's bring back our segment, Cringe Generational Cringe Millennial Moment of the Week.
Moment of the week.
Woo!
Week.
Yeah! Yes, so this week we are going to be talking about a very particular piece of Minecraft movie cringe. Now, of course, we talked about the Minecraft movie recently. I want to say maybe...
Yeah, like when the trailer first dropped, I think, or shortly after the trailer first dropped, we spoke about it. And I'm sure we'll spoke about it to some degree in the future. We'll speak about it.
Yeah, spoke about it, Brian. That's your flub for the week now. But no, so this week I want to talk about a particular TikTok trend involving the Minecraft movie. Now, Brian, are you familiar with the chicken jockey trend?
No. No, I'm not familiar. Please tell me what it is.
Hell yeah. So there is a very particular moment in the Minecraft movie. Now, I have not watched, and also I didn't even know this up until I was doing research for this, but apparently the Minecraft movie is directed by the same guy who did Nacho Libre and Napoleon Dynamite. I had no idea.
I had heard that is a guy who, you know how some filmmakers, they make something out the gate really good. I would say that the Donnie Darko guy is another good example of this. Really fully formed, really visionary thing, and they just can't follow it up.
Well, that's the thing. Even though the Minecraft movie is obviously not a creative peak for this gentleman, but it is definitely a box office peak because this movie is doing gangbusters at the box office.
Yeah, it's doing fucking boffo, which, like, unsurprisingly, you know, I can't be too, you know, it's a big IP or whatever, but it looks so bad, guys. It looks so bad.
No, it looks like fucking shit garbage. But, well, speaking of shit garbage, actually, so once again, I'm going to be talking about the chicken jockey trend. So there is a particular moment in the movie that, once again, I'm not watching this movie. I will never watch this movie in a theater.
I would watch it for free. If I'm in a situation where I can watch it without having to pay at all for it, I would.
Okay, that's totally fair.
Potentially, I would.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It was free, and it was like, hey, if you watch this, I'll never tell anybody that you watched it, but it's for free. I'd be like, sure, why not?
It heavily uses AI, right? I assume it does.
It almost
AI.
has to. Almost has to, which is probably cringe by itself. But
and
I really got to get to the chicken
awful.
jockey thing. It is wild. So the chicken jockey thing is there's a specific moment in the movie where fucking Jason Momoa's character is fighting a chicken, and Jack Black's character goes, chicken jockey. And then these brain poisoned Gen Alpha Zoomers decide to just go crazy, throw popcorn at the screen at each other, throw buckets of water on each other, and just like destroy the theater.
I just don't. It's such a weird thing, right? Because it's clearly there's a level of like they're acting obnoxious in response to the phrase chicken jockey because they're doing kind of like an irony bit, sort of. But it's sort of like through the poisonous filter of like growing up on top of an iPad where we've talked about this before. Something has happened with the understanding, the shared social contract of the movie going experience, right? And I just wish I knew what it was. is. And again, the thing I guess that I can tell I'm getting older, that's harder for me to wrap my head around, that is there's a level of like self-awareness. So clearly the joke is the chicken jockey thing is stupid. We're acting obnoxious in the theater in response to how stupid this is. It's almost like a continuation of Zoomers wearing like dress clothes to see the Minions movie, right? But a much more extreme and much more annoying continuation of that. And is it strictly a viral content thing? Is it kind of like doing a prank just to do it so you can film it? Or are they doing it without filming it even?
I think there's some truth to especially the latter that you basically said. And also on top of it, one of the chicken jockey ones, somebody actually bought a real live chicken into the theater, which first off, how the hell did that even happen in the fucking first place?
Well, that is a failure of the ushers at the theater, frankly. I hate to say it.
No, absolutely. So, yeah, the chicken jockey trend is cringe. The producer of the movie, or one of the producers of the movie, I should say, was discussing it, and he's like, I'm all for it. And it's like, well, you can certainly tell the theaters of all the fucking damage that's been going on. You could tell them that. Maybe there'll be a small civil lawsuit.
Yeah,
who the fuck knows?
He has to be all for it because it creates virality. And that's all anything is right now, right? It's all content. All art is content creation. And look, it's fine and we all live in fucking America in 2025. We're all consuming content. But, and I hate to sound, people are going to say I'm being pretentious or whatever if they ever heard me say this. Can there be a distinction between like art and commerce? Or I mean, art and content? I already know there's no distinction between art and commerce. I realize that's too much to ask. But if you are making films, could you like decide, or you're producing films, I guess even, I'm not making content. This isn't content for like the mill. Not that it has to be a highbrow art or something, but this is what you get when you equalize everything to the level of content. Is just this awful interactivity, this awful self-insertion. The producer saying they encourage this because it gives virality to the film is pretty despicable to me.
I think it is too, and like I said, we're not sticking up for obviously fucking movie theater companies because they're scumbags too.
No,
as any
but I do want
corporate
to.
entity is.
Yes, of course, but I do want to stick up for the idea, the communal experience of going to the theater. Of I know this sounds fucking corny. I know this of like cinema as a shared experience that you have to leave your home to see a film with a large group of your neighbors and share in that experience together. Because that's the original idea of it, right? It's like a film is being drawn from behind the curtain for you in a group to watch, like the unveiling of an art piece.
Yeah, that's very much true. Exactly.
Like, there's no way for me to say this without it being maudlin, but for decades, we've had this one thing where it's like you don't disrupt the theater experience because people are here because they want to see a movie. And I don't give a shit about the Minecraft movie, but if you're making it for the theater, shouldn't you expect, like, that's how theaters operate. That's how they make money. People have to work at that theater. They have to clean up after you, and other people are there because, I don't know, maybe they want to see the stupid Minecraft movie without kids throwing water on them. It's fucking weird, and it really points to a very sad sort of brain damage. And by the way, I don't think it's a young people thing because I see people my age who are just completely rotted and hollowed out from the inside out from like online interactivity. But I'm glad it's happening at the Minecraft movie. Hopefully it won't start happening at movies I want to see. I think we're already there though. I was at a screening of Texas Chainsaw Massacre a couple months ago where they had to kick someone out because they were trying to do a viral prank. So that was cool.
Yeah, that's fucking lame as shit. Jesus Christ. Are you serious? Texas Chainsaw Massacre?
It was, there were some stirrings from these people during the trailers. So I go to this theater, I'm in Portland, that shows like vintage trailers before movies. And there's some weird stirrings and people making weird noises before that. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, this is the first one, the 73 version, starts up. They show the opening scroll. Then they show the the corpse art. And someone starts like making weird, like going, whoa, really loudly, and then also like squealing, making kind of like squee noises. And then people would start looking around and looking back to see like what was going on back there, and then they'd stop. And then every 2 minutes or so they would do that again. And so they sent one of the theater operators out to see what was going on, and it was these two guys there that were like filming themselves disrupting the theater, presumably so that they could post it for content.
Theater prank gone sexual. Is that what they were doing? We trolled the whole theater in Portland. Gone sexual, gone crazy.
Well, and I remember being so like pleased by that. Are they going like, yeah, we totally trolled that theater by getting kicked out of it?
That's like that meme where it's like, oh, I acted like an idiot. It's like, look at that fucking idiot. It's like, you guys just got trolled. I acted
Yeah,
like an idiot. You believe me.
oh, you guys think I'm an inconsiderate dumbass who's not funny? Joke's on you.
Well, Brian, speaking of things that aren't cringe and aren't related to Minecraft, I think that leads perfectly into our review this week. So, once again, we're going to be recovering the band Until Your Heart Stops by Cave In. It came out in 1998. It was once again performed by the band Cave In, which I found out recently. I had a hard time finding this band because there's also another band called Cave In that are like a kind of lame, just regular rock band.
I'm not familiar with them, but that does make sense. That other bands would have this name.
Yeah, I mean it's a great band name, especially for a metalcore band, which of course we're going to get into. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, I could definitely imagine there's another band called Cave In for sure.
Like a cover band called Cave In.
Where they only cover, I don't know, Counting Crows songs or some shit.
Yeah, exactly. Blues Traveler.
Yeah. Oh my God, Brian, we have to get Popper on here. I know you and him are best friends.
Oh, my nemesis, one of my first online nemesis.
Along with Mark McGrath, right? It was Mark McGrath and John Popper.
There's a few years between them. I would say Mark McGrath was the first one. Popper went fucking crazy. He was like yelling at me on Twitter for like 5 days. It was a whole event. It's a whole arc in my life, guys.
Oh, geez. And then talking about Cave In once again. So the personnel includes, on this album specifically, Stephen Brodsky on vocals and guitar and keyboards, Adam McGrath on guitars and vocals, Caleb Schofield, rest in peace, Caleb Schofield on bass, and J.R. Connors on drums and keyboards. Now, did you do any research on Caleb Schofield, Brian? Because his death was horrifying.
I did not.
So he was, once again, the bassist on this album. And he was going through a, toll booth, I think in New Hampshire, which is his home state. And he, accidentally slammed into it, and he basically burned to death in a fire in his car,
no.
and he couldn't escape. It was horrible. It was awful. And I was reading on top of it, state legislators literally put out a bill to, allocate $20 million to improving, toll booths after that. So that was a pretty impactful death for the community. It was horrible. I think he, literally, burned to death in a car or something. So, yeah.
That is, the subject of a Cave-In lyric.
Yeah, really, right? Oh my God. I guess art came to life, right? Jesus Christ. But speaking of alive people, so there's also additional personnel on this album. This album was produced by Kurt Ballou, and of course he was also guitar, percussion, vocals, engineer, and producer on this album as well. Now, I do want to say as well about Kurt Ballou, we will definitely do a Kurt Ballou-averse, otherwise Ballou-averse on this show, because he has produced so many motherfucking albums, and including an album I do want to review very soon for the show. So this will not be the last time we talk about Kurt Ballou or Jacob Bannon. So very, very influential, obviously, to the Northeast metalcore scene, and I would just argue modern metalcore in general.
Interestingly, when you look at the additional personnel, Jay Randall of Agoraphobic Nosebleed offered up, presumably just background vocals, but that's pretty interesting. Do you know Agoraphobic Nosebleed?
I am familiar with them. They're like a grindcore band, right?
The very extreme, avant-garde grindcore band. I can see, it makes sense that the guys in Cave In would know that scene because, of course, grindcore is also big in Massachusetts in its extreme music, but kind of interesting because those are pretty different types of bands.
No, absolutely, yeah. And, once we get into some of the, later elements of this album, there's definitely a reason why this band is definitely not a metalcore band anymore. They're kind of, I wouldn't say a bland rock band, but they're definitely more of a rock band now than they are a metalcore band.
So hard to put a pin on, exactly what Cave In are. I got into them, and specifically with this album, I guess in the mid-late 2000s when I was getting really into, 90s emo as, a whole scene, which I consider Cave In part of, even though they're metalcore and they're heavier and they get weirder. I do consider this, among other things, to be an emo album. But you kind of get the sense listening to this album that they're using kind of the hardcore influence, the hardcore scene as a springboard for what they really want to do, which I don't say as a bad thing, but it makes sense that this is the only album that they made that sounds like this, right? When you look at, I always think there's in the 90s, there's I think I've even said on the show before, there's the 3 C's of metalcore, right? Which is, of course, Coalesce, Converge, and Cave In. When you look at Converge and Coalesce, those are pretty extreme bands who really could only exist in the 90s hardcore scene. They're kind of violent sounding and aggressive. Cave In aren't quite like that. They're even at this point, they feel more like they're rockers, right? It's about it's more about big, cool thrash riffs than like this pummeling, violent, rhythmic tribal sound. I know that the band themselves say that this album is converged worship, but to me it sounds extremely different from what other metalcore bands in the area were doing at the time.
No, 100% agree. And you're talking about obviously the Converge influence. Obviously this album was very influenced by Converge to a certain degree. But yeah, they do sound very different, though, I will say 100%. And then this album was released on Hydra Head Records, and it's about 54 minutes and 37 seconds long. And of course, on Amazon, it has a very high score of 4.8 out of 5. And on Rate Your Music, it has a 3.67 out of 5. So definitely a critically acclaimed album on both those platforms. And before we get into the track listing, I have one Amazon review to highlight because I'm going to be honest with you, Brian, the Amazon reviews on this one sucked shit. They were terrible. They were boring. Some of them were really funny, but I didn't want to include any of them because they had a lot of like spoilers for the track listing ahead. But I have one that I want to highlight because I think it's awesome. And it's also a pre-9/11 review, Brian, our favorite type of Amazon review.
The world you were born in no longer exists,
etc. And trust me, this review, I think, really highlights that. So our first and once again, only review here from Jeff Wurzma gives this 5 stars. And the head of the review says, the best hardcore metal CD of 1998. And this was a review made in 1999, so pretty recent. It was like the best of like 3 months later.
Yeah.
And the body of the review says, combine equal parts Pink Floyd, Slayer, Radiohead, and Converge. Shake violently and you get the latest Cave-In CD until your heart stops. Well, definitely not latest now. They put out like 10 albums since then.
Yeah.
Cave-In has taken metal to places few dared to go. Following in the footsteps of fellow Bostonians Converge. Well, they're actually from Salem, but hey, whatever, who cares? Which, by the way, we will go to Salem one day, and we will be the most annoying tourists of all time. Because apparently Salem is like a disgustingly like busy tourist town.
Yeah, I've heard that. I think it'd be fun to go to Salem. I think it'd be fun to see the scenery. We could do a metalcore tour. Probably really good restaurants there. But yeah, I will be touristy as fuck. To be honest, Taylor, when you visit Portland, I am touristy in my own state when we go to all those little like beach towns.
I mean, that's the whole thing, and that's like the local and like tourist like fucking paradox. Like locals don't really do a lot of the shit, and then tourists do all the shit that fucking is like what's the word I'm looking for? Like the staple parts of whatever area.
Yeah, the iconic, yeah.
Where Cave-In is different than 99% of bands of this genre is that the lyrics mean something and make you think, and they dare to do it professionally. Which, I mean, the lyrics on here are very poetic, but they don't really make me think a whole lot.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna lie.
Like, I don't want to be like, good lyrics for this type of band, but I've said before, I don't like a lot of metalcore lyrics. I think a lot of it, to me, is like what basically it is, which is tough guys who are like, I'm actually also deep and sensitive, and then trying to write overly verbose poetry, which is fine for this genre, but
yeah, exactly.
Funny to be like, there's no other band that's doing the lyrical depth of Pavement on Until Your Heart Stops, where they have like song titles like The End of Our Rope is a Noose, which of course just sounds like a title that any 90s emo band would have had.
Yeah, exactly. But hey, you know what? I was going to say exactly. Like, nobody listens to quote-unquote extreme music for lyrics. Like, let's be clear here. They exist.
Yeah, it's fine.
But they are not the focus. This is not pop music or hip-hop.
Yeah.
This is extreme metal and extreme hardcore.
Yeah, it's fine. They're fine lyrics. They sound cool when they're screamed.
Exactly. They don't sound... They're not like porno grind or something.
Yeah.
The production on this album, recorded at Converge guitarist Kurt Ballou Studio God City, is top-notch. And then it goes over some of the track stuff, which I don't want to go over because, of course, we're going to fucking go over it. But the last couple sentences here are hilarious. Their live show is also hard to top. He put they are entertaining, but he put the are entertaining. The are entertaining.
The are entertaining.
And even tossed bagels to the audience once. In parentheses, I didn't get one. Brodsky throws like a girl.
They tossed bagels? That's crazy. And knock these guys up.
Yeah. They released a short EP this spring that ventures more into the psychedelic space rock sound, proving their songwriting dexterity. Look for their new full length to be put out on Hydra. Oh yeah, put out on Hydra Records sometime early in 2000. So this guy was like, oh wait, is Y2K still going to happen? If it's not, listen to the new Cave-In EP.
Spoiler alert, that psychedelic space rock sound he talks about them expanding into, that becomes all Cave-In do. Not all they do. It's cool and it's expansive. They never do anything like this album again.
Damn. It's a real tragedy because even before we get into the track listing, Brian, I fucking loved this album. This is a great fucking album.
I knew you would. So I haven't heard all of the Cave and stuff after this, but I have heard Jupiter and Antenna, which are both great. They're very prog. They're still things that you could call emo or post-hardcore. But like I said, I feel like we're pretty early on using hardcore metal, extreme music as a springboard. And they were like a little bit more like a rock band. Like they were more interested in just general dynamic songwriting. Even on this album, I think that there's, the heavy parts even aren't so much about like killing someone in the pit. They're about like these kind of cool, intricate lead guitars and these kind of chugging riffs that are, more like Metallica than say, I don't know, Integrity or something.
Yeah, and that's also a band that I know you've recommended to me a lot, and I've listened to maybe like 4 or 5 songs on there, and that's another band that I would love to review an album from there.
Yeah, such an important band in like 90s hard, like the development of like what we call metalcore now, probably the most influential band.
God, fuck yeah, that's fucking awesome. But yeah, so we've talked about the review enough, so let's get into our track listing here. So first track in the album is Moral Eclipse. This is also one of the shortest songs in the album. And this is just a great opening track. Kind of reminds me a little bit of maybe Concubine from Jane Doe. It's just a great starting track, pretty hard, and just like sort of sets the tone for what this album is going to be in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I feel like Moral Eclipse really comes in. It is just them tight, locked in. It's heavy. Of course, most of this album is heavy, but it's a little bit less technical. It doesn't have so much of the kind of proggy or little sprinkles of jazzy things that this album starts to kind of throw in there. Like, to me, this song, I was listening to this album again today, and what I thought of is, this doesn't really sound like a hardcore song, even though it is the most, like, straightforward, heavy song on the album. Really, this sounds like, to me, like a thrash song. It sounds like Anthrax or Slayer or early Metallica, which not a lot of metalcore bands were quite doing that. But, it's real focus on kind of driving riffs, and I think out the gates, like, showing you, like, this, we are like a metal band. We play really tight, we play really heavy, and that's kind of what you're getting into. And it kind of doesn't scratch the surface of some of the weirder elements of this album that must have really surprised people back in the day. If you put this album on in 98, 99, you would basically, I think you were in store for like a thrash album with hardcore vocals.
Yes, absolutely. And in one of the notes I had, you talked about the thrash metal element. I did say that one of the riffs on here sounds like Rain and Blood, which I thought was very funny.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I was just not expecting that. And I'm like, oh, a Slayer riff here. Slayer sounding riff. That's interesting. Kind of threw me for a loop a little bit.
I'm glad that the one other reviewer also noticed that, because I actually was thinking, listening to this today, I was like, oh, the first couple tracks on this album do sound like thrash more than I ever realized.
No, 100%. Yeah. And, some of the reviews that I found did mention some of the more eclectic influences, but I don't remember any of them talking about thrash specifically outside of the one we just highlighted. So, because a lot of them were basically just like, yeah, this fucking rocks your socks off. Like, all the fucking, it's like, or like, rips your dick off. It makes you want to tug your nuts off and put them in your fucking asshole. And like all the like the ridiculous fucking metal guy things they said back in the day.
Also would assume that there is people that like this album that do the Tool fan thing of being like, oh, it's just so intricate. You can't even understand it unless you're reading a book about it while you listen. I'm sure that there's guys that love this album that are like that about it.
Brian, you have to have a really high IQ to understand Cave In, actually.
Oh my God. Like, this band isn't quite there because I don't think they ever made it big enough to have that audience. But this album is, like, keyed into those guys in the, like, prog elements.
No, that's totally fair. That's totally fair. And especially once we get to those tracks, we will definitely mention those elements for sure. And then the next track on here is Terminal Deity. Now, this was the one that I think was the first song to like really, really show all the eclectic influences because there's like fucking 6 different songs going on here.
Yeah.
And I also have a note here that I think this was definitely an influence on early Dillinger Escape Plan. I hear it hardcore on this song.
Yeah, I think that this album in particular was a big influence on Calculating Infinity, and I think that Cave In were an influence in general on Between the Buried and Me, although I don't know if they've ever said that, but I kind of think of Colors as like Between the Buried and Me's version of Until Your Heart Stops. Obviously, it's also like it's them doing like Dark Side of the Moon kind of, but I think in the kind of mix of tight, clean, like metal elements and then these weird but really smooth prog transitions, I feel like there'd be no Between the Buried and Me making like a career out of doing that if Cave In hadn't done it on this album.
I can definitely see that too. And I do believe that once, of course, we were talking about Caleb Schofield earlier. When he died, I think Between the Buried Me were one of the bands that were putting out that like fundraiser for his like funeral costs, I believe. So
Yeah.
that would make sense. That would
Yeah.
make sense. And of course, Every Time I Die and Converge, of course, were there too. But yeah, so that would definitely make sense that they were very much influenced by that. And that's, once again, a band we are absolutely going to cover. Either it's going to be Colors or Alaska on this fucking show
Yeah,
for
it could
sure.
be either of those. What's not Nebraska? What's the one before that? Is it just called Between the Buried and Me, the self-titled one?
Well, there's the self-titled one, and then there's something, it's like something along the floorboards or some shit like
Oh
that.
yeah, yeah. I think it would have to be Alaska or Colors, though. I think you're right. Those would be the two to get into.
Yeah, I mean, those are definitely their most iconic albums for fucking sure.
Yeah.
And then the next track is Juggernaut. Now, this is the one that has a little bit of a slower start to it. And this is also the one where you can actually hear the more verbose poetic lyrics versus the last couple songs that were definitely more screamy to them. Nothing wrong with that, of
Yeah.
course.
Brodsky does a type of vocalizing on this album that's very late 90s emo. When he's not screaming, he's doing this kind of quivery, kind of melodic but shouty thing that you saw a lot in bands like going all the way back even to like Rites of Spring and Fugazi. But when you get to like At the Drive-In, the Kinsella Brothers, it's a classic like post-hardcore like emo type vocal. Brodsky does that here, and he throws a little bit of, I don't know else to put it, kind of a fey progginess to it in the way he delivers too. It's a nice vocal style. I like when he does it. I did find myself on later tracks when he would do it getting a little bit tired of it, when he would really play up the kind of, he becomes a very strong, clean vocalist later on in Caven's career. If you look at Antenna, his vocals on that are very strong. There are moments when he does the melodic vocals, if you want to call them that here, where I can definitely tell he's really pushing it. He's really straining himself. His vocals are a mixed bag.
No, absolutely. Like, I do like the vocals on here too, but you can definitely tell he's not the strongest vocalist of all time. At least
Yeah, he's
yet.
definitely still learning at this point. However, this is my favorite song on the album. You had mentioned Terminal Deity is when the prog influence starts to creep in, and there's some tempo shifts, and there's things where it sounds like there are moments on that song where it sounds like the band are playing different tracks and they come back together. But Juggernaut is almost like, it starts off slow, like you said, and it kind of builds almost like a classic Pink Floyd song would. It is like hardcore Pink Floyd. I mean, which sounds really lame when I say it like that, but this is the first song where I feel like if you were hearing this song, again, 98, 99, 2000, you're two tracks in, you're like, oh, it's kind of mathy, it's kind of a technical metalcore album. You get to Juggernaut and you're kind of like, what the fuck is this? Because I can't think of very many other bands in the hardcore sphere that were doing this at this time.
No, I can't think of any either. And that's why I'm like, because there's so many bands on here that I'm like, this definitely influenced this and this and this and this, because this was so early in like modern metalcore to be doing this kind of shit. 100 fucking percent.
And I guess the reason I wanted to talk about this for the show, of course, we're kind of marathoning like influential millennial or influential to millennial post-hardcore albums, is at the end of the 90s, you kind of see how much hardcore had evolved. And you see that by like 98, 99, there's probably 10 other little scenes going on coming out of hardcore. Everyone's trying to guess what that genre is going to become. So you've got people doing like power violence. Of course, you have your wider metalcore scene, which is a little more extreme than Cave-In. But they seem to have been like the first band that really had the idea to be like, well, let's go for being like a big kind of conceptual rock and roll band, which of course would have been anathema to hardcore even in the early 90s. So to do that was probably a pretty, risky call. But you look into like the 2000s, and of course post-hardcore becomes a huge commercial genre there. But there are so many bands that are like taking elements of the hardcore scene and making it into this really melodic or really accessible or really proggy kind of rock, stadium rock thing. And I think that all does come back to this album.
No, I definitely see what you mean. And then, speaking of Brian, I think that leads actually perfectly into our next track here, which is The End of Our Rope is a Noose, which is that title that you had earlier that you wanted to highlight, obviously, because it's a very goofy title.
Yes.
But this one's definitely a slower song, and it sounds very, I would say, even like Southern rock influenced. And this was the song that I think was a big influence on Every Time I Die. Like, I can hear that a lot from Every Time I Die. And they actually formed in 1998, so there may be a connection there. And of course, once again, they were the people who helped boost Caleb Schofield's, once again, GoFundMe for his funeral expenses. So, there might be something there.
This song in Juggernaut, I like this whole album, of course. This is the song that people are most likely when they talk about this album to point out. It sounds so big and grand and epic. For my money, I like Juggernaut more just because I think it does a lot of the same stuff a little bit tighter. But this track, End of Our Rope is a Noose, goes all in on, it feels kind of operatic, right? It's got like 3 different sections that all flow into each other, and it seems to have sort of a narrative lyrically and sonically as well. If you go on, like, I used to be on like hardcore message boards when I was a kid, and anytime people were talking about Caven, they always wanted to talk about this song. I think a lot of people heard it and it kind of like fried their brains. I think there is a type of person who was into hardcore, was into metalcore, who for them, this song in particular was like their gateway drug that made it like, that led them to like, I don't know, like Radiohead or even to like Stereolab and kind of stuff like that. There's a whole type of person who never would have thought of that music and would have thought of it as like this indie garbage, who it seems like this song for some people unlocked something in them, like a type of person in the hardcore scene.
No, I can definitely see what you mean on that for fucking sure. All right. And then the next track on here is the first segue, which is just an instrumental. It's very much like a space rocky kind of emo instrumental.
Yeah, glad you pointed that out. So the segue parts are kind of the core of the album. And this is the point I wanted to bring up, even though it's a short little track. You pointed out this is a very emo-y track. Like this sounds kind of like, you know, like you said, space rock emo. It's kind of psychedelic, kind of Pink Floyd, got some organs going on, but this really sounds like Midwest emo. And the reason I want to point that out is because there is a person who's into metalcore who like does not like it when you call this album emo. I think this is one of the like definitive emo albums of all time. It's probably the prime example of emo also being metalcore, although there's a lot of cross-pollination between those genres. But there is a type of guy who gets so pissed off when you call Caven emo. And this style of guitar, that little kind of squiggly melody there, like this sounds like American football. This sounds like Joan of Arc. Come on.
No, I'm so glad you mentioned the American football thing because that was literally exactly what I first thought when I heard this. I'm like, this is so Midwest emo.
Which is not a bad thing. That's one of the cool things about this album. What is cool about this is if you heard metalcore band with strong elements of Midwest emo and psychedelic prog, you would think it sucked, right? You would think it was so corny. But I do think that this album really makes all of those things work together side by side in a way that makes sense. But the reason I want to point this out is because for me, my introduction to this album, as I said earlier, was when I was deep diving into like the history of emo. So when I was like in high school, like late 2000s, I literally tried to write a book about the development of emo, and it was all me getting into, I was on a lot of Adderall, so I was like getting into like theory and like kind of my half-baked ideas about the sociology of it. But this was one of the albums that I thought, I was like, this is an important album for emo as a genre because it's like intersection between like Rites of Spring and the hardcore influence and Midwest emo, and it also points towards like what emo became and sort of like this kind of screamo thing of the 2000s. So that was like my reference point for this album. So the fact that there's an army of Caven fans that go, that is not emo, is insane to me.
No, it is. It's very fucking funny, I will say. And then the next track is the title track, Until Your Heart Stops. Now, in my opinion, I know you said that Juggernaut was your favorite. I actually think this is my favorite on the album. I think this is a fucking fantastic track. Another one that was definitely an influence on Dillinger Escape Plan once again. And it also has a droning, once again, sort of space rock, sort of proggy, instrumental-ish noise at the end.
Yeah, this is a lot of people's favorite track on the album. I think this is, obviously, it's the title track. It's very anthemic. It is like literally the centerpiece of the album. One of the things that you see as we get deeper into this album, you know, we talked about a little bit early on, is it starts out as basically like a metal album. Not only is it a metalcore album on the first couple tracks, but it's kind of on the it's more metal than hardcore, right? Like, it's not, the vibe here is not the same as like Celeste, who are clearly like a hardcore band at heart, right? It's something else. And what you see as it goes on is like, yeah, they're in the hardcore scene, they're playing extreme music, but what they really seem to be about is kind of these like classic rock dynamics. This is like a band that even at this stage kind of feels like they should be playing in like arenas. Like when I listen to Cave In, even this Cave In album, I don't think of like I'm listening to some underground band, you know, that's like those basement shows where people slam dance. I feel like the way that I feel when I listen to like Jane's Addiction or Smashing Pumpkins, you know?
No, I definitely can hear what you mean on that. Because, like, this is a band that, having listened to this first album, and I know they definitely, once again, did not follow the trajectory fully on this album that they did on their subsequent releases, but it is kind of crazy to me that this band doesn't have, like, a giant cult following.
Well, especially when you look at this album and then Jupiter and Antenna, and I'm sure their albums after this are interesting. Those are the three that I know. You look at that and you go, "Oh, this is a band that had they were like a little too early to the party, but they are a band that would have been very successful in like the 2000s indie scene, you know? It's like they were doing that style a little too early. This kind of like retro prog thing mixed with like kind of like punk and hardcore aesthetics. I feel like this album, even though I say it's one of the three C's of 90s metalcore, and I 100% believe that, I feel like they're a distant third in how they get talked about. Of course, Coalesce and Converge are, for a lot of people, the definitive hardcore bands of the 90s and 2000s. Genre know them, they know this album, but it's kind of like, do you know who I meet that's really into Cave-In, or who I interact with that's really into Cave-In? It's always been this way. It's people that are more likely to be really into, you know, I think I said Tool earlier, prog people that like Radiohead. I've seen more than a few people like online say like when they're naming their favorite bands, they put Cave-In and Radiohead next to each other. There's a type of so it's kind of like that. And I'm not saying that's better or worse than them being like appealing to hardcore fans, but it's like it's interesting that they don't have the same cult status like you said, because in a lot of ways I think they are more commercially viable. And in the hardcore scene, in the like emo scene or the punk scene, it's almost like, did that work against them maybe?
Yeah, I can definitely see that because, you know, you talk about Converge and Coalesce, and like those bands were definitely not very commercially viable back then. They are
Right.
aggressive, fast, hardcore, metalcore bands.
And it's funny to me that Cave-In say that this album is Converge worship, because like obviously I hear the Converge influence, but I don't listen to this and think, oh, they're ripping off Converge. I feel like Converge are so much more brutal, and this is so much more about atmospherics and kind of vibes and like this broad spectrum of cerebral emotions and all that shit, you know?
Yeah, no, exactly. And then the next track on this album is Halo of Flies. And this was the song that I had the least amount to say. Just basically a solid song, really just had nothing to say on it. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah. So the narrative of this album sonically is that, you know, it starts off heavy, pummeling, cool, gnarly riffs, very accessible to fans of metal and thrash. And it's kind of like the prog elements, the psychedelic influence. It's sprinkled in gradually. And then by the time we're kind of in the last third of the album, it's kind of like they've settled into like, we are a like heavy prog band. This track, Halo Flies, it kind of brings it around full circle. There's some very heavy, very thrashy segments to it, but with like these time signature changes and especially these really melodic kind of like Pink Floydy lead guitars that kind of have little sections there. No, I like this track. Every time I see it, I think, oh, wouldn't it be cool if that was an Alice Cooper cover? Because of course he has a great song called Halo of Flies. They're in the pocket. At this point of the album, they're playing these epic kind of sweeping psychedelic, almost like pretty epic sounding songs. And this is a little bit of a reprieve of that. It's a little bit more of a rocker.
Yeah, most definitely. And the next song on here is very much like that, which is Bottom Feeder, which I think is probably the single most standard rock song on here. I was kind of shocked. I'm like, oh, damn, this is like just like a straight up like 90s rock song on here. I
Yeah.
was kind of blown away by it. Not even like a good or bad way. I was just like, oh my God, they went like a standard 90s rock song here.
Yeah, no, I have the same thought whenever I listen to this. So I always feel like bands that have a lot of influences, and sometimes it's really good, sometimes it's really bad. Bands always want to show off that they know other types of music that you might not think. Cave-In strike me as guys who were in the hardcore scene that, and I love this album. I'm not saying it's bad or good. I bet they wanted everyone to know when they started out so badly that they didn't just listen to hardcore. And this is like a whole track that's like, this could almost have been like on the radio in the mid 90s.
Yes, this specific song,
And,
which I'm kind of surprised if there ever was a single for this album, this song could have been it, like a radio single.
yeah, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Like, I love fucking Smashing Pumpkins and Third Eye Blind. I'm not above commercial alternative rock. But it is funny. It's like they're like, because I don't think they made this song to make money. I think they made it to show off. They wanted all the hardcore albums to be like, whoa, they just did a pop rock song just to show that they could. And when you look at the albums after this, I don't think they ever become a pop band. They remain very progressive, very experimental in their own way, very tied to like post-hardcore kind of ethos, but they definitely aren't being like a real hardcore band. They're definitely being like a rock band that's all about songwriting. And I think they put this song on here to kind of, at the time, I bet everyone thought that it was an aberration. Like, oh, they did a weird experiment where they did a rock song, but they're a metalcore band. Little did we know that that's who they are. Like in their heart, they are not like a hardcore band. They are kind of an artsy, melodic rock band.
No, absolutely, 100%. And then the penultimate song is Ebola. Now, this one predicted the Ebola outbreak of a few years ago. I'm just kidding, obviously.
I know.
But
What did they know and when did they know it?
that's the thing is that 90s metalcore bands definitely knew a lot about future fucking pandemics in Africa for sure.
Of course, the band Anthrax, very tasteless of them to pick that name 15 years before Anthrax ravaged the country. Can't believe they did that.
I can't believe they fucking did that either. But speaking of things that I can't believe they did, so once again, this song here. And this is another great track. This is a song that has some, slower moments in the middle. Once again, a very eclectic song, very balanced song. And I don't know, once again, if I would say this one's my favorite, but once again, I love everything this band is trying to do on this fucking album for sure. And this is another great example of that.
I had a feeling I was gonna ask you. I thought when I would listen to this album over the last couple of weeks, I bet Ebola is gonna be Taylor's favorite or second favorite song. Would that be pretty on point?
I don't know. I'd probably
Not
put it in the middle. I'd probably put it right in the middle.
Because I feel like, of course, this is second to last song, and I feel kind of like, we've gotten this kind of conceptual, like flowing, almost cinematic sounding album that has these peaks and valleys. It's got these space rock segments. Of course, it does have like heavy and hardcore segments, but kind of on Ebola, I feel like it's like one last song where they're kind of going to go crazy. And it kind of goes back to the Terminal City thing, where it's very heavy, very metallic, but the band kind of does some weird, I don't know, kind of dissonant things to keep you on your toes. This almost seemed like before we do our final big epic moment, they're like, we're going to do one more heavy, weird track just to kind of stir everyone up one more time.
No, I definitely can get what you mean on that. And then, speaking of Brian, I think it leads perfectly into our very last song here, which is Controlled Mayhem Then Erupts. And this is the longest track, although there is a lot of blank noise, there's a lot of ambient noise, there's some, techno, electronica, once again, like post-rock, space rocky stuff going on here. So the actual, track that has vocals on it is, 4-ish minutes long, and then the other, 9 minutes, 10 minutes is basically, like I said, blank noise and ambient noise and instrumental. It's a very interesting way to end this album, and of course, the title is fantastic. Controlled Mayhem Then Erupts. Perfect title, because that's exactly what happens.
They're literally describing the sound of this album. No, I think at least the actual song portion of this track, before you get to, of course, the ambient kind of album epilogue, it's about, 4.5 minutes, but it kind of seems like it's supposed to, they've shown us all these tricks, right? They've done all this weird shit, they've done all this pretty heavy shit. I actually don't think anything on this album is that extreme or that heavy, especially compared to other metalcore of the time, but it's, pretty metallic. And I think the idea for Controlled Mayhem is, I don't know, I think a big thing about Cave-In, especially at this point in their career, is about showing off, right? They want to fucking freak out the squares, man. They want to rattle people up in hardcore. I don't know if they did that or not. I wasn't there, but kind of every trick we've seen in this album, they try to fold in nicely on this track before ultimately doing this weird noise post-rock, end note thing.
Yes, no, exactly. Yeah, I thought this was once again a great way to end this album. I was listening to it. Once again, every song in this album, I had no idea what to expect when I fucking listened to it, because I was familiar with this band, and I think I'd heard one or two tracks from years and years and years ago, but this was a band that was just on my backlog for so long, and I just never got around to it until you recommended it for the show. And final thoughts out of the way real quick. Once again, I love this album. I think it's fantastic. I listened to this album about 2.5, 3 times. Of course, I was off for my week of debaucherous, just ridiculousness in America's capital. I did lines off
the capital
Ted Cruz's
of
ass
debauchery.
crack. Exactly, yeah. I met John Thune, and he told me about all the kids that he had fun with at Comet Ping Pong and stuff. But I was listening to this album in between those rants, right? And I will say once again, this is a great album. Good debut album. Once again, I have not listened to any of their other albums after this, but I'd be interested in listening to it. And even if a lot of Cave-In fans have maybe some negative things, which I did read about in the Amazon reviews, there were 5 reviews were they're fucking wusses now, they suck, but this album rocks. And I can't wait to hear what this album, or what their other albums sound like, because I bet you those guys are just insufferably wrong dorks.
I think you'll like it. So this album is, to me, very Taylor-friendly. You've got the prog elements. Of course, it's very heavy. It's unmistakably metal, but it's really ambitious. It's very tightly played. For my final thoughts, I've gone through ups and downs with this band, and overall with metalcore as a genre, I've gone through phases. It's not really my favorite metal or punk or whatever subgenre, but there are albums in it that I really like. There are bands in it I really like. There are moments or elements to it I really like. This album does really work for me. I've liked it since I heard it, which again, 2007, 2008, but it's never been an album that I listen to as a hardcore album. I don't put this album on when I'm in the mood where I would put on Integrity or Poison Idea or something like that. And I think there are people who kind of think about that band this way. But for me, this is like a classic rock band. Like, this is like listening to, like, yeah, like Jane's Addiction or something. It's big and it's epic, and I'm hearing people do this dynamic songwriting and play their instruments really well and kind of show off to me. I know that for people, there are people in the hardcore scene who this is a pivotal album for, and I understand why, but for me, it's always been tied into, for one thing, emo, like classic emo, and then prog. I think that's the best way to listen to that, and the best way to understand Cave In, I think, is that they were never a hardcore band. Like, even at this point in their career, it's not just that they were a hardcore band expanding their sound and incorporating other influences because they liked other things. Tons of hardcore bands do that. This is a band who kind of came up in the hardcore scene, but I think even at this stage, that's not like the type of band that they wanted to be. That's not how they perceived themselves. And I think this album makes a lot more sense when you kind of look at it that way, as like this album by these young kids kind of trying to do, yeah, like their version of like classic rock, trying to be like rock stars. And I mean that in a good way.
No, absolutely. And, you of course talked about hardcore bands that did have a lot of proggy elements in them and would have described themselves as that way. Of course, very famously, Black Flag had a lot of sort of proggy elements in their later career, but they always described themselves as a hardcore band for sure.
Well, I would say Black Flag were always hardcore, but there's also a thing where, like, later on, they were doing everything they could to alienate that scene, and definitely, like, weren't listening to any other hardcore. That doesn't seem to be the case with Cave In. Of course, they talk a lot about being fans of Converge, and I have to assume listening to this that they were familiar with Dead Guy, right? Like, they must have been.
Oh, yeah. No, abso-fucking-lutely.
I think the Dillinger influence, like you pointed out, I had never thought of it until like this week recently, because I also, this last month, I've been listening to that Calculating Infinity live album that came out a couple of years ago. Did you hear that?
I did not hear that, no.
That shit's insane. That's like old recordings, live recordings of songs from Calculating Infinity. It's crazy to hear those played live. But I was thinking about that this week and thinking, oh yeah, I guess Dillinger probably were like at least paying attention to what Cave In were doing. Cave In might not have been like the impetus for them forming. But yeah, I think when you look at Dillinger Escape Plan and then like other kind of proggy, metal-y, hardcore-y bands that became really successful in the 2000s, of course we mentioned Between the Buried and Me, Bomb. That might have happened anyways. Maybe it's just a thing of like musicians coming up in the hardcore scene and getting better at their instruments and getting bored. But I really think Cave In are the first example of that.
Yeah, that's a good point because, of course, we always talk about the, sort of, once again, the development of metalcore and mathcore and hardcore in the 90s and 2000s and stuff like that. And, as I said earlier on the tracks on this album, like, there are so many bands who could have been influenced by individual songs in this album. Like we said, Dillinger Escape Plan, I heard Every Time I Die, and we were talking about A Day to Remember, but I wouldn't be surprised if A Day to Remember guys know a couple of these fucking songs. Like, well, it's crazy to think about.
Because the whole thing with A Day to Remember, like, whether you like it or not, is that they came up out of the metalcore scene and they recognized like the inherent potential in combining that style with these big anthemic kind of pop vocals, which that potential was always in metalcore, right? But I think Cave In were some of the first people to really see that and go like, it's not necessarily about, for them, this sense of like austere, hardcore, quote unquote, integrity or whatever. It's using hardcore as a way to kind of expand their musical vocabulary. And if you're really into hardcore as like a culture or a subculture, which is cool, I can see that being really off-putting. If you're really into kind of like expansive technical music and songcraft, and especially I guess if you're into, like instrumentation, virtuosity, I would think this would be really appealing, probably to a lot of people that don't listen to a lot of metalcore or hardcore or whatever.
Yeah, this would be a great intro album to, once again, the development of metalcore in the 90s and 2000s. Because, I can tell you what an album that would not be is probably a lot of early Converge albums.
Yeah,
Like,
agreed. Because that stuff is like, that is for the in crowd. That's for people that are already pretty like acclimated to hardcore and are looking for something more extreme. This, though, like, if you wanted to get your friend that was into Pink Floyd and Radiohead into hardcore, this might be the album to do it with.
absolutely, the normie friend in your life. All right, but yes, so that shall be our review for this week. Once again, great album. Definitely recommend it. And I know we will definitely continue on, of course, this trend of 90s and early 2000s hardcore and metalcore, and we will continue with the Blueverse as well. I think we can both agree with that, Brian. Because
Yeah, I love a Jungle Book. I love
yeah.
Tailspin.
Maybe we'll do that for like an April Fool's episode sometime. We'll be like,
The
"There's the next Kurt Ballou
Ballooniverse.
album." Wait, Ballou? Really?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
just us reviewing an episode of Tailspin.
So with that all out of the way, let's get into our pluggables for this episode. So once again, you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on Twitter.com. And as well, please subscribe and follow us on both our YouTube and our Spotify channel, where we are uploading every episode simultaneously to both those platforms. And as well as always, please donate to the Lucifer and the Father campaign. Of course, now we have confirmation that both Scott, Sean, and Robert,
It's happening.
It's finally happening. Episode 2 is happening in rural Oregon. We're not going to say where it's happening, but I know, Brian, it is down the street from where you live, right? You can walk there.
Yeah, I skip and a jump. It's happening. It's happening.
Yeah.
I actually just got a brief message from Scott yesterday saying that they are just doing some tweaking. He's still polishing up some writing and things and working on some stuff. And the only thing he really said, I didn't want to ask too much, is they're going to make it, if I'm interpreting what he told me right, they're going to make it bigger. They think they can go bigger with it, which is kind of impressive to me because I felt, even just when I saw the pilot, that it was a big and ambitious concept.
Yeah, it really is 100%. Like we really respect Scott, Sean, and Robert for trying to make this happen, and the fact that they are working
gonna
on
happen.
the episodes now, it's fucking amazing. I respect the heck out of them. I'll stop
Yeah.
swearing in this context. Well, especially considering that Robert and Scott live nowhere near where they're filming. It's on the other side of the country from where they live.
Yeah, they are really putting a lot into this. And you can tell when you talk to them about it. I mean, it is a thing they've spent a lot of time thinking about and piecing together. Of course, we reviewed Reconciler with our own understanding of it from the outside, but these are people who have, spent their lives developing a craft to make films that take place outside of the mainstream studio system. They're really doing it. They're trying to make really ambitious films.
Exactly. And you know what, Brian? Oh, of course, as always, we will honor the agreement that we've always had that if you donate to the campaign, you just send us an email, send us a YouTube comment, just show us proof that you donated, and we'll match that donation to a reasonable number, about $20, $25. Because, of course, once again, even though they're working on future projects or they're working on this future episodes for this show, but we want to continue their series when we want to make Scott, Sean, and Robert's dream become a reality. But, Brian, speaking of people who are also working outside the studio system, we also want to support our good friend Luigi Mangione because he is working outside the system, if you know what I mean.
Those studio fuckers have really railroaded him. He's been blacklisted. He's tried to make some movies and they won't let him. Nobody wants to produce him anymore. He's in the same boat as John Waters.
Exactly. That's the thing is that, especially a lot of the videos that we know him from online, he was trying to work with Bang Bros and stuff like that, but he had to make independent content, apparently. That's how he worked outside the studio system.
Well, we got to make a living.
Exactly. But once again, of course, we're always aping the now official Luigi Mangione Defense Fund. I think last time I checked, there's a little over $800,000 in donations. If you want, please donate to the campaign. Both Brian and I have now donated to the campaign, and we will once again match those donations within reason. Once again, YouTube, comment, email, etc. Just show us that you did it, $20, $25, because we believe in Luigi. They're, of course, still trying to fucking railroad him. They're trying to set him up for the death penalty now and shit. Journalists who say, like, he's not Hitler are, like, being like yelled at now. It's ridiculous. They're really trying to destroy everybody who has any amount of sympathy for him.
And they won't, because guess what? This isn't a politics issue. I mean, obviously it is political, but the support he has of the people it transcends political ideology. Because first of all, they don't have anything on him. What do they fucking have? They picked him up because someone keyed him out at a McDonald's. That's nothing. And if we let them get him on the death penalty for that, what does that say about where we're at Citizens, which is already not in a great place if you haven't noticed already?
Yeah, exactly. We have to stop this continuing downward slide as much as we fucking can. We're
You
doing
have at
damage
least have
control at this point.
We at least have to resist it a little bit. And I don't mean this in like a resist way. We at least have to make it a little bit harder for them. If they're going to do it, we at least need to push back and make it a little bit harder. Give them a little bit of resistance so they can't just accelerate it all at once as fast as they can, to at least maybe give them some kind of pause. I'm so frustrated by this idea. And I'm sure I've fallen into it too, that it's like, there's nothing that we can do. There isn't a lot we can do. The one thing we can do is not make it as fucking easy as possible for them.
Exactly, 100%. Fuck the Manhattan DA, fuck Alvin Bragg, fuck the federal government trying to prosecute him for fucking non-existent reasons.
Yeah, fuck that fucking McDonald's.
Fuck that McDonald's, fuck the New York Post, fuck that lady who called in the fucking tip allegedly, who the hell knows.
Who's not going to get her fucking tip money.
Exactly. Fuck Donald Trump as always. Fuck everybody. Fuck Pam Bondi too. We gotta tell Pam Bondi to go fuck herself for sure. But yeah, so we believe in our boy Luigi. And also once again, talking about another people who are just working outside the studio system. Of course, we now have our Patreon. So please subscribe and donate to our Patreon. Of course, we have some great tiers. We've now listed them on several episodes. Just listen to those old episodes. But I promise you, all the tiers are worth it. We will not lock any content as we have now claimed. And of course, we will not do that in the future, but you can get content early. You can also help us donate to campaigns that we believe in. And as well, for one lucky patron, you can have us as a slave. You can both enslave us basically for only like $100 a month. Isn't that crazy to think about, Brian?
It is worth it. It is a real value for your money. I promise you.
A bang for your buck, if you will. But we will not bang you for a buck, to be very clear. We won't do that.
Yeah, it'll cost more for that. We have a Patreon. It's weird. I don't really know how to talk about it because it makes me feel like a jerk, but I'm working on it.
No, absolutely. And then, Brian, do you have some pluggables as well?
Follow us at Millennials Are Old Podcast or Millennials Are Old Pod on Instagram and Threads, and the Facebook page Millennials Are Old. Again, if you want to harass me violently, or you just want to parasocially be my friend, if you want to argue with me or call me gay, the best place to do that is on Instagram at Millennials Are Old Pod. I'm always looking for new recommendations for cringe content, particularly from millennials, but I'll take it from any generation. I was gonna say that's what she said, but I caught myself and I decided not to. I've thought better of it. You also can follow me at John Stab on Twitter. I've pretty much abandoned it. I'm pretending that it's for moral reasons because, I can't be asked to update my password on Twitter, so I haven't been on it.
No, it's all good. Oh, God. But yes, speaking of can't be asked to, Brian, I can't be asked to end this episode in a competent way. So I will continue to do the thing I've been doing, is making bad references to bands, to the band we're talking about. So, Brian, I think we are done reviewing this. I want to go to sleep, and I will fall asleep tonight until my heart stops beating when I'm conscious, I guess, because I'm going to be unconscious for sleep.
The end of my night is a pillow.
Yes, and I'm going to do a Converge reference because why not? But I'm going to be petitioning the empty sky and be happy that it's empty because it helps me fall asleep when it's dark outside. That's all I got.
Aww.
So have a good night, everybody, and next week we will come back with an amazing review as always.